We're now witnessing the cost of energy go up for a lot of people. Tell us a little bit more about the manifestations of this, how the causes and the impacts this has, and what you think, where do you think this trend is taking us?
I mean, really, since the 70s, more or less, where you see a lot of this decline. I think the key is that, ultimately, so in a sense, energy is fundamental, right? Because it's the industry that powers every other industry. But then from another perspective, money is fundamental. Finance is fundamental, right? Because that's delivering the capital that determines where different kinds of resources go. And just as a sideline on ESG, think about like what ESG is trying to do is it's trying to fundamentally misallocate capital. Like it's trying to take the industry that powers every other industry and then take away cost-effective energy and mandate cost ineffective energy. And that's why it's so fundamentally destructive to do that. And part of what it's doing is it's interfering with what would normally happen, which is, freedom. So if you have the freedom to allocate capital unrestrained by all this ESG stuff, and you have the freedom to develop, then you can expect over time that energy will become more and more cost effective. If you look at like the modern environmental movement becoming dominant since the 70s, what do? Well, they restrict the freedom to develop, which is the freedom to transform nature to meet our needs. The more transformative the activity involved, the more that's affected. So if you're in software, it's not affected a huge amount. It's affected via all the hardware that the software depends on. But for the software, at least, like you can start a software company and the modern anti-impact environmental movement, they're not going to stop you, like really. But if you're trying to start, you're trying to drill for oil, or you're trying to innovate in nuclear, that's where you really get hammered. So this whole anti-human impact movement, it's called the environmental movement, but it's really an anti-human impact movement. That rises in the late 60s and 70s, and that just has a total destructive impact because it means that any idea you have about how to produce energy cost effectively may not be allowed to be implemented in practice. It's putting this stop between your ability to identify how to produce energy cost effectively and your ability to implement. You contrast this with the past. I had an article maybe 12 years ago called Energy at the Speed of Thought. And it was about the early oil market and how that emerged. And it talked about there were all these competing industries. And part of what happened was if you had an idea about a productive way to produce a cost-effective way to produce energy, you could just implement it immediately. Like if you wanted to build a pipeline, you weren't allowed to just dump oil on people's land, so you had to build it well, but you could build like the first pipeline, I forget, it was 3 months or something like that, a significant pipeline. And think about how long it takes to build a yoga studio today. So this inability, this lack of freedom to develop is a huge inhibition. And then we're adding to that this fascistic ESG control of companies. And so those two forces are an enormous and fundamental drag on the entire economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's almost it's kind of unthinkable on one level, and then on the other level, it's normalized how people have just accepted the idea that it's becoming more expensive to keep your house warm in the winter. And that's just normal. People just think, there's a climate crisis, so obviously
or
it's more
blackouts
expensive.
are normal. That's even scarier.
Yeah, it's just the inevitable failure of capitalism, that capitalism is going to lead to the fact that we can't maintain grids running. But this is becoming a huge problem. Britain, which is hosting this this conference, now has the most expensive energy cost in Europe, I think, or is it Germany who's the leader?
Germany and Denmark are usually the competitors in electricity, but UK has all kinds of problems. It is the normalization is really scary. And even you look at just with, I forget what they call it, like global supply chain crisis. I don't know what the euphemism is, but just
it's called the climate crisis.
Right, but it's all completely bizarrely connected to climate. Oh my God, the weather changed so much, we can't do anything. It's totally detached from reality. But you just look at even the current, just all these failures of logistics around the world. If you understand freedom and capitalism, you immediately look at that and say, whatever else is going on, there is some impediment to freedom, because free human beings are not going to have these kinds of problems. But without understanding freedom and capitalism, then you're susceptible, like automatically assume government intervention is the cause of the problem, and you're susceptible to all these completely bizarre explanations like, oh, climate change caused it, which has no real causality at all. But you also are in danger of normalizing it, because you don't have the normal we've experienced the last 200 years with freedom and fossil fuels is that life keeps getting better and better. And that's a good thing to normalize.